wait for that. And it looks like we are live. Well, welcome everyone to the YouTube channel of All Saints with Holy Trinity, Loughborough's historic parish church. It's great to welcome you here to our online space. And if you have been here before on a Tuesday, you will know that around this time, I take a conversation online. I meet with 3 other ministers, preachers, leaders of churches who are also thinking about the lectionary texts that are coming up on Sunday. So the lectionary is a pattern and schedule of readings that takes us through the scriptures over a 3-year cycle, and each week there's different passages to look at. And I have a little conversation, and I set this up at the beginning of lockdown. I've really enjoyed doing it. It's been a way for me personally to kind of keep engaged with the scriptures and remind myself what I'm really for, because sometimes I can get lost in just managing churches and all that stuff. So I found it really helpful personally, but also I wanted to set it up to engage with different voices and different people. I'm a real believer that we hear God speaking when we engage with scripture, but particularly when we engage with scripture in the context of community. So listening to different people, hearing from different people's experiences. So this is my last one before my little summer break. We will be back in the autumn though, in September. But today I'm really pleased to welcome back 2 former guests to this, which is lovely. And 1 new person to join the crowd. So as they introduce themselves, if you're watching live, do please use the comments to say hello. Let us know that you're watching and join in with the conversation. Really keen that we all kind of chip in. And while they're introducing themselves, I shall type up into the comment the readings that we are looking at today. And an exciting new development, if you're watching live this Tuesday lunchtime and you don't use YouTube to comment, but you use Twitter, if you want to put comments, hellos or questions on Twitter using the hashtag #MinistersMuse, I'm going to see if I can multitask and look at my Twitter thread as well. So we'll see what happens. That might work, that might not. So I'm going to reveal my guests. They are going to introduce themselves to you as I write up what our readings are today. So thank you. Please take it away.
Hello, good morning, I'm Loretta. We have been here before together. I'm vicar in Kegworth, which is just a little bit north of Loughborough, and there's 6 small churches that I have the delight of being the team rector of. It's great to be here today. Like Wendy, I've really enjoyed these sessions, but I have to say I'm not here entirely because of me. I'm here because our Archdeacon was scheduled to be here and she's a bit under the weather today. So hi Claire, hope you're feeling a bit better, and thanks for the space.
And I'm Sue Wallace. I work for a charity, the Transcendence Trust, which runs the Sanctum conferences and the Sanctum Facebook group. We basically try and enable people to be more creative in their worship. Before that, I was in cathedral ministry. I was a presenter, so I'm interested in liturgy and music and basically helping people to worship God. And that's me.
I didn't realise I was muted. Hi, I'm Fanny and Nana. I am down in London, Northwest London. I, until recently, was a member of a really diverse local parish Church of England church where I've preached and led worship. And right now I'm between churches, but my work is in diversity and inclusion, so I've been doing loads of work with churches through everything that 2020 is bringing up with Black Lives Matter. So yeah, that's my context. And my doorbell's just gone, so I'm going to go and grab that and be right back.
This is very much live and going really well, really well. I think it's because we're a bit more happy. It's that sort of, yes, into holiday season. I'm just finishing writing up the hashtag in the comments section. So I'm going to do that. I can't find that key, that's what I want there. And a very warm welcome to the Reverend Chris Taylor. Hello, Chris. It's great to have you with us today. Chris was actually one of my very, very first guests, and he offered Minister's Muse. I need to put an S in that. Minister's Muse, there we go. Yeah, he got off to a good start, and I do hope he's coming back to join me in the autumn as well. But Chris, do chip in as we go through our live conversation. Right, do I have a full panel again? Yes, I do. Wonderful. Right, so we have 3 texts to look at today, as we always do, and we are going to start with the gospel reading. So we are in Matthew's gospel, and today a short little passage in some ways for a lectionary text. We are looking at Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. And it's this moment which is often thought of, I suppose, in a classic biblical commentary as the pivotal point in the gospel. It's the moment where Peter recognises that Jesus is the Christ. Sue, you were going to kick us off with this one. What are you drawing?
Right. Yeah. Yes, I had a bit of a sense of deja vu looking at this passage today, because St. Peter's Day was only at the end of June, and actually I thought, hang on a minute, we've been here fairly recently, and on that occasion I was actually preaching at St. Peter's in Bournemouth, so I was asked to it was the very first Sunday after lockdown as well, so it was the whole sort of patronal festival belated after lockdown. And I think that whole thing about locking and unlocking and keys and releasing was really interesting in that context. So for me at that time, it was all about the binding and the loosing, that Peter's given these keys. And I don't think they're just for him. I think they're for us too. They're passed on to the church. And I think we all have gifting and roles to be agents of liberation in our communities, and to spot those situations where we can loose people, but also agents of binding in our communities, where we can bind up those things which are oppressing people. So to have that power, and to know that we have that power of binding and loosing, I think is really powerful and important in relation to this passage and this gift that Jesus has given to Peter.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, what draws your eye? In some ways, I kind of glossed over that bit, partly because I find it, I don't quite know what to do with it. But I love that you've shone some light on that for me, Sue, actually. And
again, it's about the context. It's about us and our lives and the passage and the context, and being unlocked from lockdown really drew a magnifying glass over that for me, I think.
Yeah. It's a very extraordinary time to be preaching sermons right now. It colours and shapes everything that we speak on. Larissa, what about you in this passage?
The thing that really struck me was this whole kind of seeming contradiction of calling Peter the rock. Because actually of all the disciples, he's the least kind of reliable, isn't he? If you're going to build anything on anybody, would you build it on Peter? He's the one that just is impulsive and reckless. I mean, gloriously so, but it's just that kind of irony, I think, of saying, you're the rock on which I'm going to build my church. And I think that for me is quite a kind of an interesting thing. Where would I go with that? What would I want to explore?
And of course, it follows on last week. We had him getting his feet wet and the walking on the water and the impulsion and all of that stuff. So maybe a wobbly rock. Chris comments, he says, I'm pretty sure this sits bang in the middle of the gospel. It really does form a hinge. Just as in Mark, it signals the beginning of the journey to Jerusalem and the loosing of authority and the very small beginnings from which Peter's leadership begins to grow. Thank you, Chris. Yeah. Natalia and Anna, well.
It's interesting. I think I don't see Peter as wobbly. I see him as, what I see that God admires is that we try again. Peter is the only one to get out of the boat, and we have a choice when we look at that story. Do we look at the fact of, you looked at the waves, you're numpty, or do we say he's the only one who got out of the boat? Like, what the heck? Like, this dude walked on water. Like, yeah, he's a rock. And for me, there's something so beautiful in seeing throughout all of these passages of the theme of power. And what I see in this is Jesus, God, is giving out power. He's giving out power to those who don't traditionally have it. and he's actually just democratizing it and saying, you were going to be the rock. And I love the fact that it's countercultural to our Western rationalism of the post-Enlightenment, very Hellenistic perfection view of like a rock must be perfect and solid. Now, like actually it's an organic, malleable, iterative process, and Jesus works with Peter on forming him into a rock. So it's not a final fixed thing. It's like, oh, you're in a process of becoming. So almost like not you are a rock, but you will be, because you already have it in you, and I'm forming it with you, because out of all of them, you run away, but you keep coming back. So that gives me hope and joy. And as a former teacher, I'm like, yeah, that's it. Like the kids who keep coming back to try and try again, it almost is very freeing as well for us in our failings, but also seeing we have a God who delineates power. So for me, I'm like, where I hold power, where can I open that up and bring other people who don't have access to it? How can I make space for it? Or am I Pharaoh who holds on to it? Like, check yourself, Natalia and Anna. So that for me is what speaks out.
And I wondered, does that correct a little bit to do with what you were saying about the unlocking and the binding? Is there resonance with you in that?
Yeah, and I love the fact that Jesus is always calling Peter into being.
Yes.
Calling him the rock. And in that calling, he's becoming the rock, which is wonderful.
It reminds me a bit, as you were talking, the idea, I mean, I'm not artistic at all, it's not one of my gifts, but don't sculptors sort of talk about, you sort of, they see what is in a block, and they kind of, so I can't remember, maybe someone did quote it, some sculptor person, I need all my art.
Michelangelo about the statue of David.
Oh yeah, that he was always in there or something, and what you're doing, you're taking away and revealing. I don't know.
That's a big Aristotle thing as well. Actually, he talks about beauty always being there, and it's the artist's job to reveal it.
Yeah. So is that what Jesus is doing with us? So interestingly, so the other part of the text, of course, is Jesus saying, who do people say I am, and who do you say I am? It just occurs to me, is there something about Peter's helping draw out of Jesus who he is? I don't know. Does Jesus need to hear him name him? I don't know. I might just disagree with myself as I say it. But on that, is there? Because last week, was it last week? Yes, it wasn't walking on water last week. Actually, that was 2 weeks ago. It was the Canaanite women's faith last week, and that really strikes me that I like the idea that the Canaanite woman teaches Jesus about something about who he is and his ministry, and I wonder, is there something in this passage where Peter naming Jesus as the Messiah? I don't know. Is Jesus sort of just
love it?
Maybe, I don't know.
Well, to be human is to be changed by our interactions with people, isn't it? That is an essential thing about being human. That's not weak. That's not sinful. That's not flawed. So why shouldn't Jesus be changed by his interactions with people?
Preach.
Wow, I like that. A few more comments coming through. Chris says there's also issues to preach here around who am I. One might find something here about personal identity and the need for affirmation. Thank you, Chris. Also, just like Peter last week, rock sink. Yeah, that's a good point. And Helen says, she's logged on as Stephen Cliff, but it is Helen. Thank you, Helen. Taps into the idea of what we call ourselves and others, what labels we put on ourselves and others really matters for destiny. How we, So again, so maybe that thing with Jesus hearing, you are the Messiah, that kind of names who he is. Anyone want to come back again on this, or should we park it for a little bit?
I think it's really significant that Jesus asks Peter to name it, because if somebody asks you something, actually to name what you're about or to name the problem, actually then you do have a much stronger kind of hold on it, don't you? You do get it a lot more than just if they tell you.
The speaking out.
To me, again, that also links in with the idea of power, and Jesus not just declaring it and saying, look, you've seen me walk on water and now I'm telling you, but there's much more, you're part of the process, actually what you see, what you understand. And I sort of disagree with, like, often it's said, Jesus, like Peter reveals or recognizes Jesus the Messiah. It's like, he may have known this for ages. This may not be a revelation for Peter. He's articulating it to Jesus for the first time, but he's clearly been thinking about this. It's clearly been germinating. So there's something there in sort of timing and who else is present with the other disciples and Jesus being ready for it to be declared. And maybe also, I love Wendy's like stimulating point of maybe also Yeshua being ready to step into that identity. And that for me sort of sits a bit uncomfortable with where I was a year ago of this Platonic sort of idea of, but Jesus must have had perfect knowledge. He must have been omniscient. And now I'm deconstructing that. I'm like, well, A, where does it say that in the Bible? Nowhere. And B, why are you so uncomfortable with that? And like Loretta said, of to be human is to grow, is to be shaped, is to be changed by interaction. So recognizing for myself of that's far more Aristotelian, and I think far more true of the picture we have of God throughout the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament than this Platonic idea that Jesus must have been perfect and known everything and been very rigid and omniscient. I remember this guy.
I remember hearing a preacher years ago, sort of talking about, sort of saying, you know, what does Jesus do? You think a teenager think, you know, the morning he wakes up and realizes he's the Son of God. You know, what do you do that day? I'm the Son of God. A few other people have joined us. Welcome. Hi Lee, hi Sean. Do chip in, bring your thoughts to our conversation. And Dean, hello Dean, welcome. And Dean says there is a powerful aspect of agency in this passage. The power aspect is incredibly important in naming nature and allowing growth with the power that does not destroy. Oh, right. Oh my goodness, we could keep going. And yeah, oh, and Chris says to you, Natalia and Anna, he says great stuff. So, you know, we're feeling the love today. Right, we could keep going. Let's go to Romans next, because I have to say, I feel like with this, especially if you've been with us for a few weeks, you'll know that I find it a bit hard wading through Paul, particularly in Romans. And I feel like this is now like a little passage that's like balm to the soul. We've ploughed through all this heavy theology and Paul's wrestling with Israel's role in salvation. And these verses, Romans 12, 1-8, are just, well, for me, I just think they're beautiful. They contain these words about, you know, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And a little glimmer of the one body stuff, which also, of course, is unpacked bigger in Corinthians. I like this one. This is Paul that I like. I like this. That's really bad to say. Obviously, all of St. Paul.
There's no good or bad.
Loretta, I think you were going to kick us off with Romans, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a familiar passage in lots of ways, isn't it? But there was a couple of things that really struck me, one of which actually really picks up on Natalia and Anna's point about perfection, because there's that, I don't know if we've all got the same version, but this is NRSV. In verse 2, it says, you might discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And I wonder about that perfect word. That's the one that sort of tripped me up. And I thought, actually, I think I'm more comfortable with some idea about wholeness there rather than perfection. You know, what's good in God's purposes, what's acceptable in God's purposes, but then something about wholeness or even holiness rather than perfect. That was the bit I first was kind of, what's this got to say to us?
Prick under the skin, they're kind of like
yeah. And particularly, I think if we're talking about Peter and that whole thing about, you know, he was no way perfect, but actually he was open and he was coming back, and he was all of those things that we've kind of celebrated about him this morning. So that was the first bit. Don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that.
Do you want to anyone want to respond to the perfect thing, and then we'll come back to you, Loretta? I mean, I do know I've got a note in my Bible. It says, which I guess is an alternative textual translation, what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So maybe it's not quite so static. You know, what is the perfect will of God? Might be slightly different. This is where I always regret the fact that I just did Greek for Dummies at theological college. I wasn't really clever enough to be
more than me.
So yeah, this is where we need our sort of textual people. But Sue, Natalia, Nana, things about the perfect word, anything strike you?
I'd love to, but I'll let Sue go first because I know I keep jumping in. Go on.
Yeah, I noticed that bit of it. I think for me it's been the bit slightly before that, one of our preachers, I used to be in York, and one of our preachers at St Michael's used to say about, he had this phrase, the trouble with living sacrifices is they keep crawling off the altar. And I loved that phrase, that it was like, yes, we give ourselves to God, we give our lives to God, and then we keep taking it back again. And we end up sort of going off in our own direction and then coming back and representing ourselves to God and asking God what God wants to do with us. And that spiral and cycle happens a lot, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm a real etymologist. I love sort of words, and for me, what I'm doing more and more is noticing, what is my reaction? So like Loretta said, of like, oh, when I come upon a word, what do I feel? What do I respond? And then I'm saying, okay, well, why do you have those associations? So deconstructing within myself, why do I have these associations? Who decided, what white man, probably decided that perfect equal, this Platonic idea of the perfect forms and things are fixed, was actually the Hebrew Israelite Jewish like idea of perfection was malleable, was moving, was actually, like, I think of like the sea being perfect, but it's in constant motion. So I just think for myself, actually, okay, breaking out of this idea that for something to be perfect, it's static, it's fixed, it's rigid, it's finite, like a clay pot that's been glazed. And I'm now running a small Bible group, and we're calling it the Play-Doh Bible group, because it's like, actually, Play-Doh is perfect because you can reform it, it's malleable, it's colorful, it's interactive. You can still leave it there and it can be fixed. If you don't touch it, you can just leave it there and it'll be there forever, give it a dust every couple of weeks. Or you can keep molding it and shaping it. And for me, I'm more and more thinking, well, that for me is perfection. Something it is a constant state of movement, because movement is growth. So I think of God's will, God's perfect will, not as a fix. Natalia, Nana, this is your path of life, and don't fall off the path, the pilgrim's progress, you know, don't go off the way. Of much more, it's much broader, it's much more fluid, and dancing a step forward and steps back and a dip, and you fall and you stumble and you get back up and you twirl and you're like, whoa, where am I? I'm like, ooh, that perfection I can sit with.
I'm really interested in that. I hadn't really thought of that, but again, maybe there's something here around the power conversation we were having earlier. Who dictates what perfection looks like? And oh my goodness, don't we know about that as women, in terms of, you know, what is the perfect female form? We are inundated with that. I wonder if there is there something that rescues us a little bit? Oh, that sounds very Pauline. Who will rescue us from this misogyny?
Frees us, liberates us.
But in talking about, in the second part of the little passage, about we are one body and individually we are members, and then there's the beginning of a bit of a diverse list of the different gifts that we have. So actually, so he talks in the latter part about those who prophesy, those who teach, those who are generous, and so on. So if we get back into the idea of a conversation about perfection, actually perfection looks like different things, doesn't it? Because it's shaped around our gifts and so on. I just want to bring in those again who are on the comments. I noticed that Rachel's joined us. Hi Rachel, hope lunch is going well. She's usually got something she's eating at this point of the day. Rachel says perfect meaning wholeness is a really lovely interpretation. And Chris has been running a little thread here. I love the idea that our bodies in and of themselves, and by extension us, are holy and acceptable to God, no judgment or condemnation. Perfection is what God has made, therefore we are all perfect. Play-Doh is perfect, we are perfect as we are. Yes, and still molded and perfected as we go and grow. So there's this idea of perfection as process rather than ideal. And Helen chips in, God's power is made perfect in weakness, which of course we do in other places, don't we? Loretta, was there more in this passage? You sort of
I mean, this end bit is really, you could preach on this every week, couldn't you? But what struck me this morning is we are members of one another. That whole idea that we belong to each other. And I'm quite inspired by that, really, because actually if we belong to one another, it's a different deal. Then it takes away the kind of competitive comparison type mentality, and actually is more of a kind of celebratory thing. So, you know, Natalia and Anna, if you are flourishing and we belong to one another, that's my flourishing too. And actually, Wendy, if you are struggling and we belong to one another, that's my struggle too. And I know we've heard these things before, but sometimes they just get you, don't they? And I just felt in a really good way actually that was a positive kind of sharing thing that maybe in this season it's good to remind ourselves of, because I've just been to see a lovely old couple to do home communion, and you know, they have been quite isolated, you know, and we can sort of separate ourselves a bit and forget that we are members of one another. Yeah, so that was the other bit I just wanted to kind of sit with, really.
Particularly in this time, what the pandemic's done to us and separated us out from people, and people's experiences have been so different. So we've had people who absolutely they've reconnected with an old hobby and it's just been lovely or whatever, and people whose experiences have been horrendous and really bad for mental health and so on. And also a connection, I think, into the global church. I know we've got a global audience today, do please chip in, but you know, we belong to a much bigger picture than just our own, don't we? Sue, any reflections on that side of the passage?
Yeah, I think it's so important. Because the gifts are given to us as a community. We don't have all the talents. None of us has the complete package. We need to rely on each other and work together. And there's something beautiful about seeing people discover their giftings and be released into that. And also for me, I think I was looking at the different interpretations of different translations of, you know, exhorter and exhortation, and I really like the translation which says encourager, because I think the gift of encouragement is so important. And thinking that all those amazing artists and musicians and preachers and leaders, behind them all there's somebody who's been egging them on and encouraging them and spotting their gifts and giving them a chance to have a go and grow in that gifting. And those people are often unseen but are vitally important. I'm often struck by, I think it was Elgar, that he always had this sense that he was no good at composing, even after he had a knighthood. And it was his wife who was the amazing encourager. And sadly, when she died, he didn't write anything anymore. But her encouragement was as important as his musical talent. It's amazing.
There's something to celebrate there, isn't there? Again, in a sermon about, because often the other gifts are quite obvious. I mean, we've got some strong preachers around the table today, and you know, those of us who are upfront people, our gifts are fairly obvious. But actually the quieter gifts, the gifts that make us the body, we have to celebrate those, don't we, as well? We really, really, really do. We could go on, but I'm wondering if we move to Exodus, we'll kind of circle back around, because I think in some ways there are some themes that thread these a little bit. I'll just say before we move on, Chris says, my struggle is your struggle, my joy is your joy, my pain is your pain. Yeah. Amen, isn't it just? And Dean has just chipped in and said, developing a solidarity that is beyond ourselves. Thank you, Dean. So, Exodus now. If you've been with us over the last few weeks, if the lectionary is your constant companion, we follow the continuous lectionary for the purposes of this Muse, and we've been going through Genesis, setting the scene, or the patriarchs. And now we come to the beginning of the Exodus text. So it's quite a long text, actually, for lectionary reading. I reckon a lot of churches will duck it just because of the length. But it's Exodus 1, verse 8 to chapter 2, verse 10. And this sets the scene for all that is to follow. It's around the key theological text, you know, to understand Christ, you have to understand the Exodus. It's the beginning of the scene with Moses. I have to say, I think I shared this last week. As a church, we're reading We Need to Talk About Race by Ben Lindsay, and just reading it really slowly to really sit with the lessons we're learning. And just even last week, just reading the fact that in terms of colonialism and the slave trade, the slave traders might have wanted to make their slaves Christian, but they didn't want to give them the book of Exodus. Because in the book of Exodus, there's a different narrative, and there's power in this narrative. And I have to say that's sort of shaping my own thinking as I come to this today. But Natalia and Anna, you were drawn to the Exodus text. Where did you go? What's stuck into your heart?
Yeah. For me, it very much does flow and connecting with Romans, and particularly that sense of, like, for me in Romans, when he talks about be transformed by the renewing of your mind, do not conform to the pattern of the world. That makes me think, okay, well, stop. What is the pattern of the world? And so often when I hear church, and Christians talk about worldliness, it's all about, oh, don't swear, and oh, don't have sex before marriage, and oh, don't smoke. And it's these really obvious but very puritanical Victorian things. And I'm like, that's not really what Jesus chats about. It's not really that, not saying it's not a big deal to him, but obviously wasn't big enough for him to actually chat about, so it tells you something. What he talks about a lot is power. Oh, funnily though, churches don't preach about that so much, particularly institutional, entrenched churches, Church of England, and particular, like there are themes of patriarchy, of white supremacy. And when I look at our world, and I'm loving that you've mentioned colonialism, because we're in a post-colonial world, so the whole world has been affected, and we're in an international globalized world, so the whole world has been affected by these themes. They haven't been contained to the West or Northern Hemisphere. They've taken root in the whole world. So actually those themes, the themes of the world, is power, is white supremacy, is neoliberal capitalism, is patriarchy, ableism. So I'm like, oh, to me, that's then what Paul, and I love Paul, like reading Steve Chalk's work on Paul and listening to his Nomad podcast. I just instruct all of you, I invite all of you to listen to Steve Chalk's podcast and the Nomad podcast on St. Paul. I've listened to it like 3 or 4 times. He will make you fall in love with Paul the liberator, Paul the equalizer, Paul the writer of justice and freedom, who's been tragically misunderstood. So just thank you, Steve Chalk. But I'm like, okay, those are the things that come out again and again. And I can then trace that from Romans. Well, that's Exodus. It's interesting when you say you've been working through the patriarchs. I'm like, oh, I'd love to say we've been working through the book of the matriarchs, and their hidden, untold stories, the matriarchs who enable the patriarchs. So I'm like, oh, so actually God here is using women. This whole story, I'm just laughing loud. I'm just like, lol, Pharaoh, you're so dumb. Like, you've underestimated women. We're so invisible to you, you idiot, that actually you're here telling the Hebrew women to kill the sons, and you actually think they're going to do it. Like, wow, you so think that you've got it like that. You think women are going to do what you say because you're Pharaoh. Your own daughter isn't even obeying you. Like, you're just so blind by your own power, by your own supremacy, that you so underestimate women, and God uses that. Women are the heroines and heroes of this story. Like Moses, you ain't nothing without your mama, without your sister, oh, and later without your wife. But their stories are the ones who we get like a little line, little, oh, she's not even named. Don't even know his mama's name.
I'm so glad you've gone with that, because I love these 2 midwives, so Shifra and Pua, these are the heroines for me of the Hebrew scriptures. And in fact, actually, just always gone a little bit mad on the comments. So Rachel says, I just love the midwives. They were just like, no, we are not going to kill babies. They are like early protesters against injustice, making a difference in their own way, in their lives, to their work. And I think there is this thing around, isn't there? Because women are so often unnamed in scripture, when they're named, it's like, oh my goodness, their story really carries. I absolutely love them. I'm going to bring in Sue and Loretta for a minute, and then I'll come back round again to you, Natalia and Anna. So just, hold whatever else is coming out of this. Sue, are you with the midwives? Are you down in the bushes with Moses? What's stirring you in this passage?
It was the midwives for me that really struck me this time. Really struck me. And I think that's the whole thing about, as you said, lots of women aren't named in the Bible. And when they are named, it's significant. So you have to think, okay, they've given these people a name. What's going on? It's like a big red flag. This is important when they are named, just because of the position of women in those days. And I read somewhere that they were the first recorded incidents of civil disobedience. And I love that. And if you trace the line of what happened because of them, we're looking at a really important whole in salvation history. It's amazing what they have done. And so they were the ones that really struck me. Their actions, their deliberate inaction, they're protecting, and they're risking their lives to do it, because, like, are you going to be more scared of what God thinks or what Pharaoh thinks? And they're going with, we must do what God thinks. We must do the right thing here. And as a result, the lineage that happened, the liberation of the people, and actually looking towards what happens with that prophecy in the whole book of Exodus, prophecy in action of what happens with our own liberation too. It's amazing. It's all traced back to them. So I love it.
Oh, there's a whole lot of sermons that needs to be written from this. Loretta. Oh, unmute yourself. You see, we don't want silenced women on this.
The character that really stood out for me actually was Moses' sister, and it was that bit where she stood at a distance to see what would happen, because I think my own instinct would have been to just race on in there and do the thing, but actually no, she stopped and she waited, and there was a kind of a space and a opportunity that opened up because of that. And yeah, I felt that was very significant. She didn't race on in. She just stood and watched and waited. And then she was so shrewd, wasn't she? I don't know if it was because she gave herself that time, but, you know, to kind of go, oh, could I help, in a way that it made it look like, well, it was Pharaoh's daughter's idea. You know, it wasn't, you know, I know the child's mother, I'll organise this. No, it was much more subtle, much more clever and shrewd, but I think it was enabled by her stopping and waiting. So that for me just felt like I can see that's a really helpful thing there.
Yeah, it calls to mind Jesus talking about you need to be wise as serpents, innocent as doves. Because all the women in this are slightly duplicitous, aren't they? You know, and you've got to wonder about Pharaoh's daughter, because I wonder what she's risking to do this. Now, lots of people are kind of like, oh, we've got PREACH exclamation mark preachers. Says Helen. She got very excited by that. Rachel says, I love that they use the ignorance and this is about the midwives. I love that they use the ignorance and racist tropes of the Israelite women. They have so many babies that they just pop out, using ignorance against them. So Pharaoh's like, yes, that sounds about right. And Dean says, love the midwives who lived truth to power and brought life. And yeah, Chris, civil disobedience, non-violent protests, early doors. Dean says, if it wasn't for the women, ... Oh, we like you, Dean, you can come on again. And Helen says, women are not dainty and squeamish and shy of doing what it takes to get the job done. The midwives in Exodus, Jael of tent peg fame. Oh, another of my favourite passages. You've got to have a strong stomach to get through that reading. Rizpah camping out with dead bodies. Women of valor. Oh, and I think it's a bit of Hebrew, isn't it? Eshat Chayil, I don't know how to pronounce it. And Rachel echoes, yeah. Yes, it's Helen, not Stephen. She's using her husband's YouTube thing. You know, I'm sure we could unpack that.
A version, right there.
But there we go. So yeah, we're loving all of this. But there's got to be more in this passage. Natalia, Nana, what next?
Yeah, this passage I think should just be something that is studied for weeks, for months. I learned a lot from the theologian Rennie August, who's a South African theologian. She's got this wonderful book, Seeking Peace, that is available free actually on the Tear Fund website. And it's a biblical pilgrimage, and it's about a lot of it's decolonization and deconstruction, and she introduced me to the concept of like the Hebrew women as the social justice warriors, the defiance of corrupt leadership. And definitely rereading that in this period and in the context of preparing for this, I just think that immediately to me calls to mind BLM 2020. And one thing I found so saddening, that again was partly sort of me stepping away from my church, as much as I loved it, I've been there 17 years, was the fact that for so many white Christians, the issue was, but the protesters are not protesting politely enough. It was okay. Your issue isn't with actually dismantling the systems of oppression and power, which is where Jesus is actually at. Your issue is in policing it. And I'm like, okay, look, we have a legacy here of disrupting power, of rejecting it, of actually subverting it. But also, let's not forget that actually it does also bring violence. We do have a God who is violent as well when needs be, when all else fails. And even Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, into the end of his life, he was saying, actually, yeah, there are times where violence is necessary, where they don't listen. Then actually, sometimes that is the only form of expression of the oppressed and the only thing that will make people listen. So for me, I'm like, this is all in with the wonderful stew. And I see it as such a relevant current text. And sort of my invitation and my challenge, particularly to white church leaders, is, well, who are you aligning with in this passage? You know, like Wendy mentioning the commenter, sorry, on the comments mentioning the racist tropes of, okay, these are African Hebrew women, these are African women that we're talking about. So actually, these are African freedom fighters, these are African liberators, these are Africans who are rejecting authority, earthly authority, and actually subverting it and challenging it and like redirecting it. And yeah, using the racist, misogynistic tropes against them. What I love is verse 22, where the idiotic Pharaoh, like such an idiot, he's like, oh yeah, just kill the boys but let the girls live. I'm like, have you learned nothing about women yet, you imbecile? Like, seriously? Like, cool, let us live, we'll just revolt, but we'll do it so slyly that, you know, we'll pander to a bit of patriarchal male power so that we can get our way. And then the revolution is at dawn. So yeah, I love it. I'm here for it. I think it's wonderfully empowering. I just hope that, particularly, yourselves with the pulpit access that you have parity, that you have. How are you as white women in leadership positions in the Church of England using your pulpit, using your access to preach about overthrowing systems of injustice? And is it a preach or is it lived throughout the week? So that's my hope.
Wow. I feel like I've got to go do something different this afternoon. I was going to quite, you know, I feel like I need to not write a rota and do something much more liberating and challenging power. Although my strapline has always been changing the church one PCC meeting at a time. It's not going particularly well, but you know, generally speaking, it's not a bad thing to run with. Sue, anything else you want to come back in this passage?
Doing a rota actually giving away power.
Yeah. Who's not on the rota, who can be and should be, and why are the people who are on the rota?
Okay, I've got it. I'm making a note. Come on, Sue, give us more.
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so much in it, isn't there? It's just the whole big story of Exodus is just so amazing. Yeah, and I think I was also struck by the difference between, and I'm just thinking, when Jesus says turn the other cheek, he's not being passive. Turn the other cheek, do nothing. The being passive is to do nothing. The turning the other cheek is actually being profoundly subversive. And it's how you can be profoundly subversive in a non-violent way. Fight against the system. And this whole passage has lots and lots of little things which are like that. Like hiding the child, not doing what they say, not killing the children, the midwives work. And there's so many other little things that you just think, that's a really sneaky way of fighting against the system in a non-violent way, of turning the cheek, of putting that message, okay, you've hit me on this cheek, so I'm just going to show you this one. Not
we've just had a comment that says, preach the revolution, sisters, from Chris. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is slightly against us, so we're gonna dial down our revolution, or we're gonna crystallize it. We're also drawing towards the end of our time, but I always ask my guests, okay, we've had this conversation, you might have done some of your own prep as well. If you are preaching on Sunday, or if you were preaching on Sunday and these were the texts that you had, what kind of sermon might be brewing for you? Where might you go with a text? Now, I know, Sue, you actually are preaching, aren't you? In fact, and you were last week as well when you were on. So is there something that's shaped up for you? Where might you be?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go with the gospel because it's safer when you're visiting a different church, just in case you don't know what you get for the other reading. But of course, I've preached on that gospel in that church only about a month ago. And so that adds extra complexity. But what was actually working with me and speaking to me so much this week was naming, and the issue of naming. And it's there in Exodus as well. And I think their other reading is probably going to be that Exodus one. But this whole thing about actually working through the scriptures, what Jesus calls people is significant. What God calls people is significant. When names are changed, that's significant. When people are named who aren't normally named, that's significant. I think exploring that name, that whole issue of naming and names and destinies, and Peter growing into becoming that rock because Jesus has called it into being. I think that's the avenue I want to explore.
Thank you. And where can people hear you this Sunday? You will be back at...
I'll be at St Peter's in Bournemouth.
And are they live streaming to the world?
I don't think they are actually at the moment. They do some of them, but I think the techie people are on holiday.
All comes down to, yeah, who's got the dongle? Loretta, are you preaching this Sunday? You've got a very...
I don't think I am preaching this Sunday, actually. I think my colleague is preaching, but I feel quite challenged as a kind of white woman speaking to a very white audience, how I can speak with conviction about some of the things that we've talked about this morning. And I think particularly this idea of perfection being a kind of a moving, growing thing. Yeah, I think I kind of want to kind of like hone in on that, and how, you know, how we belong to one another, how subversion can be part of perfection. That's a really interesting thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Those midwives, they were in the perfection thing, weren't they?
Yeah, subversion is a form of perfection. Ooh, that's a sermon that's got to be written. I feel a pastoral letter from the vicar coming on to, you know, watch out, Haven and Kegworth benefice. Natalia, Nana, you're kind of floating around at the minute, but if you were...
Yeah, I'm church free, church non-aligned at the moment. Yeah, but if I were preaching, I love preaching. I'm missing it. I'm really grateful, actually. I've got a few preaching opportunities coming up and that I'm looking forward to. But if I were preaching on this, for me, I'd probably touch on all of them, because one thing I love doing is actually showing the link. We can so often see them as separate, segregated like teachings, and actually it's like, no, the themes are there. The theme of power, who has it? Why do they have it? And how can we actually share it? Because that's what Jesus models. And for those who don't have power, actually, how can we? But I love that Loretta's point about belonging to each other. So I'm like, okay, actually, that in itself is sort of very anti-capitalistic, because capitalism is very much about ownership as oppression, and I own you and therefore I restrict you. Whereas God's belonging is, we belong to each other, and there's a freedom, there's a freeing in that. Belonging in friendship, belonging in family, belonging in marriage is meant to be, I think, about freeing you to be your fullest, freest, deepest self. So for me, I definitely preach something about what are the patterns of this world that we're experiencing, and how can we non-conform to them? Because to conform is to sin. To non-conform is to bring freedom, and where freedom is, that is where God is.
Oh, I'd like to hear that sermon. I'm not preaching either. We're not having a preachy summer. We're just reflecting on scriptures together as a church. But when I first looked at these, I did think it was time for a civil disobedience sermon, actually, which I'm really pleased, because Rachel's Rachel does belong to the church that I lead. Rachel says, so basically we need to preach non-violent civil disobedience this week, right? I think that was slightly where my heart went in reading the Exodus passage particularly. But then I'm particularly, with our conversation now, linking that into power, and how that links into, especially Paul's words in Romans, to not be conformed to this world, and how across a whole range of subjects, whether it's around our relationship with the environment, our relationship around poverty in this country, injustice, our relationship around race and inclusion, how are we a bit more shifra and pua, and the place of civil disobedience in Christian living. Well, I tell you what a way to end the first term of Ministers Muse. I'm exhausted, actually, and I've got to go and write a radically power challenging rota, which I will indeed. Oh, fantastic. And thank you. Natalia is just putting in the chat the resources that you mentioned are the Nomad podcast with Steve Chalk. I'm sure all folks who are watching, you can Google away at that. And the other one was Seeking Peace, which you can find on the Tear Fund website. So thank you for that. Thank you to everyone who has been chipping into the conversation today. I do hope that you'll rejoin me in September, where I shall be welcoming back other guests, and these guests I hope will come back and join me again. But it's been a real privilege to share with Sue, Natalia, Nana and Loretta today, and all of my guests over the last few months. God's word is alive and active in the world, which is a wonderful thing to celebrate. Thanks so much for being in. I'll see you really soon.
Thank you. Happy holiday.
Bye-bye.